All right, ready to go? Amazing. Crash course part 2. Last week we ended up discussing really the history of the Jewish people, really from creation, from year 0 in the Jewish calendar, really to the year 2488 ballpark, from creation, right when the Jews are on the cusp of entering the land of Israel. Functionally, if you're following along in your scriptures, in your Tanakh, your Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, what we talked about in class 1 was basically Jewish history through the end of the period of the 5 books of the Torah. Our plan for today, what I'd like to cover, seeing how far we get to in time-wise, is I'd like to talk about the Jews entering the land of Israel, the period of the first Beis HaMikdash, the first temple era, and then the second temple era. So we're going to cover basically from the year 2448 from creation till, I don't know, another about 1,500 years, give or take, something like that. And maybe just sort of to frame it, and to give it the perspective. This is obviously going to be talking about where the Jews, the Jewish people, we're going to be in the land of Israel. That's going to be the bulk of today's discussion. And of course, when the Jews are in the land of Israel, the central part of when the Jews were autonomous or semi-autonomous in the land of Israel would be the Beis HaMikdash, the temple or the Mishkan, the tabernacle. That was always going to be the center part or of the central parts of the Jewish experience in Israel. It's an interesting medrash. Rashi quotes it. It's a fascinating story. You remember the story with Joseph and Jacob? Joseph is sold. We talked about this last week. Joseph is sold into slavery. That whole story, and Jacob thinks his son is killed. Turns out he's alive, and part of it. So it's actually going to tell the story. And Joseph's brother Benjamin also thinks that his brother Joseph is dead. So Joseph eventually, the whole story, gets reunited with his father, and it also gets reunited with with his brother Benjamin. So Benjamin gets reunited with Joseph. Remember that story? Back in Egypt, Joseph's now the viceroy, the whole thing. It's a remarkable story because what happens? Joseph and Benjamin, they embrace. They haven't seen each other. Benjamin thinks that Joseph is dead. Joseph never thought he'd be able to ever see his brother ever again. They reunite. What a moment of emotion, of joy. Can you imagine that reunion? You know, think of like when the hostages, you ever see the videos of hostages getting reunited with their family? It's a tremendous moment of joy, of simcha, and the verse says what happens, that Benjamin falls on Joseph's shoulder and cries, or his neck and cries, and Joseph falls on Benjamin's necks, in plural, and cries. What's going on? Why are they falling on each other's necks? And Benjamin, plural, his neck, he only has one neck as far as I'm aware. What's this a reference to? And of course, Rashi tells us is that at this moment, unclear to me why, but for some reason at this moment, at that moment of reunion, they have a moment of Ruach HaKodesh, which is a form of prophecy, a level kind of some type of divine communication. I don't know why it happens at this moment, but for whatever reason, at this moment, Joseph prophesies that the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, which partially stood in the territory of Benjamin, was to be destroyed 2 times, hence the necks. The neck is somehow a reference to the temple. He sees prophetically that the 2 temples, which would be in Benjamin's territory, were to be destroyed. And Benjamin, at the same time, he receives a prophecy. He sees again, it's not quite a prophecy, but a prophetic vision. He sees that the tabernacle, the Mishkan, we'll talk about in a moment, which would eventually make it into the tribe, into the territory of Joseph, well, that was also to be destroyed or at least captured. And when they see, and that was singular. So Joseph sees the temples, Benjamin sees the Mishkan, they see that they're not to last, and they cry. And my rabbi, my Shiva, always used to hide. Isn't that amazing? Like, here you are at this moment of joy. They finally see each other to embrace. And for whatever reason, they have this flash of prophetic vision of the destruction of the temples, of the capturing of the Mishkan, and they're overcome with emotion of grief on the destruction of the temple, on the capturing the Beis HaMikdash. Do the math, by the way. If you do the math, from that point in Jewish history to the end of to the destruction of the second temple era, of the second temple, it's about 1700 years. So it's a little bit shorter, but not by much, from when we're standing to the destruction of the second temple. And we think it's like such a distant thing. We don't even realize what was the Beis HaMikdash, what was the temple. It's some like distant thing. If you're in tune to what the Beis Hamikdash was, what it meant to have autonomy, to have the temple, to have the Beis Hamikdash, Joseph and Benjamin, when they, embrace and have that moment of love and joy and celebration, they're overcome with the grief when they realize that the Beis Hamikdash isn't to last. Because when you understand what it means to have the Beis Hamikdash, when you understand what it means to have the temple, you realize that its loss is a far greater tragedy than it is the joy of greeting your brother who you thought was dead, which is a really remarkable idea. And maybe it's something that we should, when you think of our paradigms, we talk about the Jewish experience during the period that we're going to talk about for about 1,500 years, ballpark, where the Jews have autonomy in the land of Israel. It's all about their ability to serve God. It's all about the primacy of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, of the Beis Hamikdash. Where we left off last week was the Jews are about to enter into the land of Israel. Of course, Moses is their leader. He dies. We don't know where he's buried, presumably somewhere in Jordan, modern-day Jordan. And of course, what happens is his prized student, Yoshua bin Nun, God tells Moshe, and Moshe appoints Joshua to be the leader of the Jewish people. And Joshua, of course, leads the Jews into the land of Israel. They enter into the land of Israel miraculously, triumphantly, miracles, splitting not quite of the sea, but the Jordan River splits, miracles. And the Jews, interesting, is for one of the first things that they do when they get into the land of Israel, of course, is they accept the bris of Arvos, the covenant of responsibility of one to another. They take an oath, a covenant on Har Gerizim, Har Evel, Mount Gerizim, Mount Evel, and the Jews become a bonded people. We're connected one to another. We talk about the concept of, have you ever heard the expression, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh? It's a concept, a term that the Talmud talks about all the time. Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh. People translate that incorrectly to mean all Jews are connected one to another. That's how the expression, it's used colloquially. People use it, and it's true that we are all connected. Jews are all connected one to another, but it's actually a mistranslation and a misunderstanding of what that concept actually means. When the Jews were, one of the first things that happened as they enter into the land of Israel, they enter into a covenant with God where they become Arvim. Mazeh Arev. Who's our Hebrew speaker? What's an Arev? Nadav, what's an Arev? What's the word Arev? Vouch. A legal term. It's a legal term. Who's it? What's an Arev? Thank you. An Arev is a cosigner. A cosigner on a mortgage, on a note, right? If you have a mortgage on your house, sometimes you'll need a cosigner to back up the mortgage, the payment. That's called an Arev. Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh comes from that language. We are all cosigners one to another. Meaning, when the Jewish people entered into the land of Israel, it's a fascinating thing. We talk about my relationship with God, my relationship with my Judaism, my relationship with the Torah. My relationship with God, my relationship with the Torah, my relationship with Judaism is not just my problem. It's your problem, it's your problem, and it's your problem because you entered into a covenant, well, your grandparents entered into a covenant with God and the Jewish people. One of the first things that they did when they entered into the land of Israel at Mount Gerizim, Mount Evel, is they took responsibility. Arvut, they were co-signers that everyone's responsible for the next guy's spirituality. And when one Jew sins in Kentucky, it's the Jew in Idaho's problem. We're responsible for one another. So when we talk about Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh, all Jews, it means, yes, we are all connected to one another, but it's a far deeper concept. It means we are responsible for others' spiritual well-being. And it has many, many ramifications. That's one of the first things that happens when the Jews entered the land of Israel. Of course, the Jewish people tell Joshua, just like we were connected to Moses, and just like we felt that sense of duty and appreciation to Moses, so too we feel that connection to you. However, the Talmud tells us that the face of Moses was like the sun. The face of Joshua, of course, was like the moon. This is a concept in Judaism. I believe this deeply. It's a concept called Hiskatnu Hadoros. You ever heard of that concept? Hitkatnu Hadorot, which means the generations weaken. It's an idea we really do believe in Judaism. I really believe it, is that the farther we get from Sinai, actually the weaker we are. We're one generation removed. We're one link in the chain farther away from Sinai, farther away from that rendezvous with God. And the farther we get, the weaker we are. Now, ultimately, it's like we talked about last week, we're in our generation, and it's not a very wise thing, says King Solomon, to say, Why don't we have the leaders that we had in previous generations? Says King Solomon, Lo mechachma sha'alta zos. It's not a wise thing to say because you are where you are. There's not much you can do about it, but the reality is true. Joshua is like the moon. Moses is like the sun. I believe this is true not just in Jewish history. I happen to think it's true in all histories. If you look, everyone knows I love American history. If you study the figures in American history, you, in my opinion, you clearly see a diminution of strength of character. They don't make many Harry Trumans anymore. They don't make, and a good way of saying it, Ronald Reagan was no Harry Truman, right? We don't make many Ronald Reagans today. But Reagan was no Truman. Truman was no Lincoln. Lincoln was no Washington. There is a clear downward slope. That's in my opinion. I feel that very strongly. If you just study these people and their character, these are amazing people. But there is a concept of hiskatnu hadoros. The generations get weakened. The Jews enter the land of Israel. They spend the next 14 years with kivush v'chiluk. They spent 14 years conquering the land, driving out the nations that had been squatting in the land, which they understood and knew was the Jewish people's land. Many of the nations left. They knew they were settling, illegally, and they actually left. The Jews were obligated and commanded to drive out the people around them. Now, they didn't have to wage war. They were actually supposed to offer not so much peace, but to actually ask them peacefully to leave and get out and to recognize your squatters. And as I mentioned, many did. Now, the reason why God wanted these people out is because the people settling the land, these were people who lived immoral lives, people who had values contrary to the Torah. And God in his wisdom understood an idea that we talk about all the time, Rambam tells us, such an important lesson in life, derech briusa shel adam leos nimshach b'deyosav uv'maisav achar ohav avareav u'bnei medinosav, which roughly translates into, do you catch all of that? Which means it's the nature of mankind. You get influenced by the people around you. And you have all these nations who were idolatrous, pagans, who did not value human life or morality. And God understood if we want to build a Jewish land, a place where we have a primacy to Torah values and ideals, you cannot be surrounded. It's not going to work when you have people who don't believe in those values living with you. So the idea is get them out. And they spent the next 14 years driving out their enemies, driving out these nations that were squatting in the land. And most of them left, but the Jews, to their discredit, did not drive out all of the peoples of the lands. And that would be a sore spot for the next 1,000 years of Jewish history. You have the Philistines, for example, the Plishtim, one of the nations who my understanding was they were on the coast. The Jews didn't drive them out. Some of the other nations weren't totally driven out, and they would constantly be harassing the Jewish people for the next 1,000 years. The land is then divided according to the tribes. 12 different tribes, different lands. 2.5 of the tribes are actually outside the land of Israel to the east. And the Jews go from a nomadic nation that had been in the desert, and they now live in the land. There's no capital city yet. No real capital city. And tribalism over the next few generations is really going to emerge, where the tribe of, for example, Reuven will be antagonistic to the tribe of Naphtali. I'm just using as an example. You have these different tribes, and there was not as much of a cohesion as there should have been. The center of, to whatever degree there was a center of Jewish life, would be the Mishkan. If you recall, the Jews, when they were in the desert, they had the Mishkan, which was the tabernacle, the temple that was a portable temple, as it were. When the Jews were in the desert, they would take it down and put it back up every time they had to travel. But it was somewhat portable. It was not it was not a permanent location to be the center of Jewish service and worship of God. That Mishkan, once the Jews entered the land of Israel, so they kept the Mishkan. They didn't put it, they did not yet establish a capital city. So the Mishkan, it's kind of like, think of like an RV. You have an RV, but like it stayed in an RV park for a couple hundred years, 480, something like that years, in the town of Shiloh, which is in, as we mentioned, the tribe of Joseph. For the next 400 and some odd years, it's called the period of the Shoftim, the judges. If you're looking, by way of comparison, or just so you know where we're at in the scriptures, in the Nevi'im, right? You have the first book, you have the 5 books of the Torah, and then the books of the Nevi'im, the prophets. You have Yeshua, the book of Joshua, which really goes through the story of Joshua, talks about that covenant at Har Gerizim and at Mount Gerizim, Mount Aval, and then talks about the process of them, the different wars that they fought, and the 31 city-states that they had to drive out. I believe it's 31. And then it's the, talks about how they divided the land and a couple other stories. Then you get to the book of Judges, Shoftim. What happened for the next several centuries is the Jews had, it's basically the following pattern. This is what happened. The Jews, they had a leader, and great leader would eventually die or whatever, and the Jews there was some kind of peace and stability, and then the Jews would get complacent. They would learn the idolatrous ways of the people around them, and they would slip spiritually, start engaging in idolatry, immorality, things like that, and the spiritual level of the Jewish people sank. What happened? God, as a way of waking up the Jews, what did he do? He sent one of these nations, usually the Plishtim, the Philistines, but sometimes other nations, to attack the Jewish people in the land of Israel as a way of saying, wake up. The Jews, of course, what happened? They woke up and they prayed to God, help us, save us. And God would send a shofet, a leader. Shofet literally means a judge, but it was a leader. It was not a king. This person did not have a real official leadership role, but unofficially there was a series of several shoftim leaders who would lead the people, drive out the enemies, create a little bit of a restoration of Jewish life. The Jewish people would get inspired, their enemies would be driven out, and then what would happen? They would get lulled back into a pattern of do things monotonously and mechanically, stop being very observant, learn a lot of the pagan ways of their Gentile nations around them that were in the land of Israel, and then this wash, rinse, repeat. The cycle would happen, right? The enemies would attack. They would call out to God. God would send a shofet, a judge, a leader. They would drive out the enemies. They would then be all thankful and appreciative. And then if you read the book of Shoftim, the book of the Judges, it's literally this cycle after cycle after cycle. Some of these judges you may have heard of. They're prominent people in Jewish history, people like Shimshon, Samson, you may have heard of. There are many of these people are significant Jewish heroes. Many of them were really not particularly historically significant in the sense they were not giants of people. Many of them were somewhat mediocre, I guess would be the right way of saying it. I don't know if that's a fair way of saying it, but they don't stand out historically. And overall, the period of the Shoftim was not a particularly, as a matter of fact, remember the book of Ruth, the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth, according to most opinions, takes place during this period of 400 and some odd years. How does the beginning of the book of Ruth begin? The book of Ruth, how does it begin? Vayhi b'yamei shvot hashoftim. It was during the times of the judgment of the judges. Well, what does that mean? The judgment of the judges, as if to say the judges were being judged because they weren't doing a particularly good job. Everyone was questioning them. God was questioning them. It was a very turbulent period for these few centuries. It was a pretty turbulent period. One of the great catastrophes. There was a period of anarchy. You may remember the story of Pilegesh Begiva. There was this horrific moment of a woman was raped, and then her body was defiled, and then there were some real low parts and low points in Jewish history during this time. The final person who really is in this period of the judges of the Shoftim, God sent. One of the judges, again, in this pattern was a great man. His name was Shmuel, Samuel. He'd be sort of the last figure of this period. And again, following along in the scripture, this is now sort of the beginning of the book of Shmuel Aleph, Samuel 1. Who was Shmuel? Shmuel would end up basically being a circuit rider. What's a circuit? Let's talk about American history. You talk about circuits, right? The federal circuit and districts. You have circuits, and why are they called circuits? You know what I'm talking about? In the judicial system, they're called circuits. Why are they called circuits? Because back in the good old day, Richard knows what I'm talking about. Back in the good old, what did they used to do? Judges used to ride on horseback and make a circuit, go from town to town to town. It's opposed to everyone coming to the judge would come to you. That's what Samuel did. He was a circuit judge. He would go from town to town preaching and judging and leading. He was a towering figure, and it was right before, it was in the early part of his career, even before he was actually the judge and the leader. That's when Mishkan Shiloh, the Mishkan, which was in Shiloh, it was captured, and the Mishkan, right, it wasn't like destroyed fully, but it was that period came to the end. The ark would be captured, be uncaptured, it would be go back and forth, and sort of the center of Jewish service would shift from a few different places for the next, I think it's 52 years. After Shiloh, it would go to a place called Nov, it would go to a few other places, and would bounce around. And but Shmuel was a sort of like a strong force at the end of this period. Of course, towards the end of Shmuel's career, the people come to Shmuel, they go to Samuel, and they say, we want a king. It's been almost a half a millennia. We want a proper king to rule over us. Now, the truth of the matter is the Torah talks about setting up a king, saying the function of the king was to be an executive, to be a leader. You need strong leadership in any group, in any nation, any society. The Torah even talks about the rules, the laws of what a king does and what a king can't do. And according to this, it's a matter of disagreement in the commentaries, but Ramban, who is, I think, probably the most basic or simplest approach, I believe it's Ramban. I might be misquoting, but I'm pretty sure it's the Ramban, who learns that there was indeed a concept of setting up a king. And for the Jewish people to ask Samuel, hey, we want a king, that in theory wasn't a problem. The problem was that the Jewish people said, we want a king. You know why? Because we want to be kechol hagoyim. We want to be just like all the other nations of the world. All the other nations have kings. We want a king too. That was the failure. Because as Jews, we don't care what kechol hagoyim are. It doesn't matter what your neighbor is doing. It doesn't matter what that nation is doing. It doesn't matter what the other country is doing. We do what's right. The Torah says we should have a king. That's fine. But if our motivation is because we want to blend in, guess what? The Jewish people, we're always going to be different. We're always going to be unique. And we judge, and we should be motivated not to be kechol hagoyim. That's not our mission. That's not our mandate to be just like any other nation in the world. We will always be different. And that was an important message. And Samuel criticizes the Jewish people and tells them like this, you're motivated for the wrong reasons. In any event, God selects the king, find a man who is literally head and shoulders. You ever heard of the expression head and shoulders taller than the rest of the nation? Where does that expression come from? It comes from the book of Samuel, because Samuel identifies a man who was, the verse tells us, head and shoulders taller than everyone else. Who was that? Shaul HaMelech, King Shaul. Saul was a pious, righteous man, a great man. And he is anointed by Samuel to be the king of the Jewish people. And he drives out many of the enemies. He drives out most of the enemies. But Shaul ultimately, he's a fascinating character in Jewish history. Really one of the most if you just read the scriptures and you just read the story, you might think he was an evil person. Of course, that's not true. The Talmud tells us he was a great man, evidenced by the fact Shaul is a common Jewish name. There's always a general rule. We don't name people after evil villains, right? You've heard the name Shaul, Saul. It's a popular, common Jewish name. It's because he was a good figure. He was a good person and an important figure in Jewish history, but like all of us, he was imperfect. And his imperfections did get him into trouble. Specifically, two things that Shaul messed up with is that there's a mitzvah in the Torah to destroy the nation state of Amalek. Amalek represents evil in the world. Amalek is the personification of evil, of cruelty, of immorality. Amalek the nation had no value for human life, no value for decency. They were the Nazis incarnate. That's who Amalek was. Many have a tradition. Actually, Germany and ancient Germany is somehow historically connected to the nation of Amalek. And Shaul had the ability to destroy the nation of Amalek, but he had compassion on the king, on a few of them at the end, some of those, and he's found tremendously at fault for misplaced compassion. His job was to destroy the enemy because these were evil people. And he was, and he would lose the monarchy because of that. There's really a different reason, or a separate reason why he loses the monarchy. The story goes, most people don't know this story. Rashi alludes to it. It is found in the Navi, in Shmuel and Samuel 1. It's a remarkable story. It's a remarkable story that we read about. Saul, he's now the king. Now, by the way, his reign lasts for only 2 years. You read the story, think he's like the king for 20 years. It's not, from what I understand, if I recall correct, he's only king for 2 years. But he has a jam-packed 2 years. A lot happens during his reign. He has all these wages, these wars, drives out the enemies, but not fully. During one of his battles, they were going to fight with Amalek, this nation, this evil nation state of Amalek. And Samuel tells Saul, we're going to go wage war in 7 days. So stay tight with all the troops, with all the soldiers. They amassed all the battalions and all the armies. He says, stay here, and in 7 days, I'm going to return. And when I return, what we're going to do is we're going to offer a service, a sacrifice. We're going to say some prayers and do some sacrifices. Once we do that, we're going to go to war. Okay, that was the plan. What happened? What happened was it's day 6. And just put yourself in the scene. Saul is there with all of his soldiers, with the entire army, and they're ready to go. They're rearing to roll. And Shaul tells the army, hey, Samuel said, wait 7 days. It's 6.5 days. So we're almost there, but let's just wait 7 days. It's 6.8 days. A couple hours later, Samuel's not there. The army's getting antsy. We got to go. We got to go. It's go time. And Shaul says, I don't know. He said 7 days. Let's wait all 7 days. 6.9 days. It's like, I don't know, a few minutes left in the day. Samuel's nowhere to be seen. The army is driving him crazy. We got to go. We got to go. We got to fight. We got to go. He's looking at his watch. There's a few minutes left. He's feeling all this pressure from the nation, all this pressure from the army. What does Shaul do? He says, fine, we'll do the service by ourselves. We're not going to wait any longer. He does the service, brings the sacrifice, does the service, the whole thing, right? And at 6.999 days, right, just a minute, whatever, just a few moments before the end of the day, what happens? Who shows up, of course? Shmuel shows up. And Shmuel says, what happened? And Saul says, we were waiting for you, You didn't show up. So we decided, we'll do the service on our own so we can get going. And Samuel, of course, says, because you didn't listen to the word of God, you have lost the monarchy. And you will not be king. Your descendants won't be the king. And says Rashi, it's such an important lesson in life. Says Rashi, you know what the lesson there is? It wasn't like a mitzvah in the Torah. It wasn't like there's a verse in the Torah, one of the 613 mitzvahs, where God tells Moses, go tell Saul, wait 7 days. That's not what happened. What happened over here? It's called a mitzvah midivrei neviim. There's a rule you do have to listen to a prophet, but in the hierarchy, in the priority list of mitzvahs, this isn't like the most important. It's not like the most important mitzvah. It's what we would call a detail. It was a detail that Saul should have listened to the details of Samuel, and Samuel said 7 days. He waited 6.99 days, and he did, right? And he didn't wait. And says Rashi, you know why? You know what this teaches us? In a lesson that we all know is true. Things that are important in life, you know what? Details matter. And 6.99 days, guess what? Is not 7. It's close, but it's not 7. And anyone, if you've ever been in any important business meeting, if you ever had any kind of important contract, any kind of important moment in your life, you know you can't be sloppy on details. You could be sloppy on details when things don't matter. But things that are important, details matter. And because Saul was not attentive to details, he is not befitting to be the king. It's interesting is that the verse tells that Shmuel, when he sees, and really the other incident when Shaul then doesn't do the full job destroying Amalek, Shmuel accuses, he tells Shaul, he says, you know what one of the reasons, you know what one of your problems is? He says, Halo, im katan ata beinecha, rosh shiftei Yisrael ata. It's such one of the most powerful verses in all of Torah. Halo im katan ata beinecha. You don't view yourself, you are small in your own eyes. When really, rosh shiftei Yisrael ata, when you are the head of the Jewish people. Shaul did not hold himself in the high enough regard that he should have held himself. And that's a very important lesson. Sometimes our biggest failures is we don't appreciate our own greatness. Now, sometimes we're over arrogant and we think we're so great. That's also a problem. But misplaced humility, that's not humility. When a person doesn't understand their importance, when Shaul said, whatever, I'm not so important, that was part of his failure, and that's an important lesson. And of course, what happens, Shaul ultimately gets killed in battle by the Philistines. And well, the truth is, back it up just a little bit. Shmuel, before Shaul dies, tells Saul that I want you to know the kingdom, the malchus, the monarchy is going to be shifted from you, and it's going to go to who? Your son-in-law. Who's your son-in-law? There was this little shepherd boy, redhead kid, who liked playing the guitar, and his name is David. David HaMelech, King David. King David. David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayim. King David, of course, would be a towering figure in Jewish history. And Shmuel tells King Saul that David, who ends up marrying Shaul's daughter, he will be the next king of the Jewish people. It's at this point in the story, it's actually a very important lesson. If you read the story and you study the history, what happens? Shaul then goes through these fits of mania, literally mania, trying to kill David. But what's so interesting is if you read the story, so again, why do we think Shaul is a good person? He tries killing King David. That's not a good thing. His own son-in-law. Because what does the verse tell us? That Shaul was afflicted with ruach ra, with an evil spirit. What does that mean? Different opinion, but according to Radak, one of the classic commentaries, he translates that using Hebrew to melancholy. What's melancholy? Depression. Shaul suffered from real mental illness at the end of his life. And to some degree, and even King David, who is at the receiving end of Shaul's wrath, Shaul tried killing him on several occasions. Even David, who's the victim, has the compassion to realize this isn't my father-in-law. This isn't Saul. He actually was afflicted with mental illness. There's like, he has his literally demons. That's not a Jewish idea, but he was afflicted with mental illness and was to some degree not responsible for his own actions. That's an important lesson in real life. You know, something that's a taboo topic, mental health and mental illness. Shaul HaMelech, one of the great giants of Jewish history. Yes, he wasn't perfect and he does lose the monarchy, not because he's evil. It's just because he wasn't quite good enough to be the king. But he was almost good enough to be the king, which means he was a great, great, great man. And historically, his reputation is as a great man. Someone like that can suffer from mental illness. And there's no shame. And we have to be honest when either ourselves or loved ones struggle emotionally, psychologically, to seek treatment and to be aware of that. King David becomes the Jewish monarch. And it takes him a while, and he has a very turbulent life. Many people try to usurp his authority. And it takes him a while to consolidate his reign, but eventually he does. And King David is the one who establishes a capital city for Jerusalem, for Israel in Jerusalem, in the mountains of Judea. Whose territory is Jerusalem? It's in Judah, the tribe of Judah. What nation was there? The Jebusites. Maybe we'll get to that in just a moment. The Jebusites. Jerusalem is established on the granary of a fellow named Arnon, or Arnona, and that's where Jerusalem is established. Now, the story of David, we're not going to go into, but there are a lot of stories and episodes with David. And one will read, you could read some of the story and some of the history, and you think he's an evil person. Story with Bathsheba, you think like he committed all these sins. The Talmud, of course, tells us, Kol Misha Omer David Chota Eina Ala Toa. If you think that David was this sinner, this person driven by lust and horrible things, you're making a terrible mistake. You have to read the comment. Of course, the Torah and the Navi, the prophets, are not written to be understood always they have a literal understanding, but their interpretation, sometimes the Torah and the Navi and the prophet uses very harsh language to describe mistakes which aren't quite as egregious when given the fullest context, but the Navi will oftentimes write it in a very harsh way, because for great people, if you make a mistake, even if it's a slight mistake, well, considering your greatness, so I'll give you an example. You're a football player. A guy drops a pass in the NFL. Got to make that catch. You do realize that 99 million out of 100 million people can't make that catch. That's great, but you're in the NFL. You need to make that catch. And, great people are held to higher standards. Of course, King David, he wages wars. He drives out enemies. He consolidates Israel. And because he was involved in warfare, God feels it's not appropriate for you, although David, you establish and identify Jerusalem and build the capital city of Jerusalem, David wasn't the right person to build the temple, the Beis HaMikdash. Who would be that person? One of his children, Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech. Solomon, one of David's children, he would be the next king. And it was Solomon, of course, King Solomon, who's blessed with tremendous wisdom. He was the one who builds the temple. Now, just where we are, we just went through the book of Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Beis, Samuel 1 and Samuel 2. Beginning of the book of Kings, Kings 1, we read about Shlomo, in the middle of Kings 1, if I recall correctly. You read about Shlomo, King Solomon, as he gets older, so his son, so this is where things get dicey. He has a son who'd be the next king. His name, of course, was Rechavam. Now, Rechavam had a question. He wasn't sure what to do. During his father's lifetime, they had to issue a lot of taxes to build the Beis HaMikdash, to build the capital city, and the Jewish people were heavily taxed, right? It made sense. They had a lot of infrastructure, a lot of things that needed to happen. And many of the people came to Rechavam now that Shlomo has died, Solomon is dead. Rehoboam, he's the new king. And they say, look, the Beis HaMikdash is built, the temple is built, Jerusalem is built. Maybe we should ease up on the taxes. And of course, what happens? The elders, they say that's actually a good idea. It's a good idea. Should ease up on the taxes. It's time, right? We don't have the same needs. Ease up on the taxes. Rechavam asks the young whippersnappers, the young kids, what do you think we should do? And what do you think the young kids said? His young advisors, young guys. They said, no, you need to raise taxes. You need to show them who's boss. And it was a tremendous mistake. And there's a lesson to be learned there. There's something to be said for experience and wisdom of elders, people who have had a little bit more experience, a little bit more wisdom, who've seen the world, who can know to make judgment. And it was considered a terrible, terrible mistake. He raises the taxes and the people get very frustrated. And it leads to civil war. Because in the north, there was a fellow named Yeravam ben Nevat, who he's really envious of all the prestige that Rechavam gets, but he's annoyed with the raised taxes. The tribes to the north are upset. And one thing leads to another, and the northern kingdom, the northern 10 tribes in Israel break away, and there's a civil war. The southern kingdom, which are the tribes of Judah, which is roughly where Jerusalem is now, and Benjamin, which is, from what I understand, a little farther south and towards the Dead Sea, that would be the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. And they would split. And you have the 10 other tribes up to the north and the 2 tribes in the south. And they would split. And they would never get back together again. And you have this civil war, this division within the Jewish people between Yeravam and Rechavam. Now, the tribe down to the south would be the tribe, it was called the Judean kingdom, the southern kingdom, and you have the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom would stay around for the next 250 years, ballpark. Without fail, without exception, all of the kings of the northern kingdom, all the leaders of the northern kingdom were evil people, horrific villains, murderers, idolaters, pagans, who really ran the Jewish people in the northern kingdom into the ground, to the point where there was no Torah observance, there was no Judaism being practiced in those northern kingdoms. And it was a terrible, horrific period. You had some of the worst villains in Jewish people. Remember, you probably heard of Jezebel, Izebel, Achav. You have these horrific leaders of the Jewish people who were murderers, it was a period with just unceasing evilness. The southern kingdom, and by the way, those kings, the leaders of the north, it was not necessarily hereditary because they were constantly getting assassinated and other people grabbing power. And it was not a hereditary monarchy, but there was always a king. And this is really, if you read the book of Malachim Beis, Kings 1 and then really Kings 2, you read the story of all these horrific people, and the story of Achav, and the story of Izebel, and the story of all these terrible, terrible leaders, and the terrible crisis that was the story of the Jewish people in the northern kingdom. In the southern kingdom, what happened? It was on again, off again. You had some very pious leaders of the Jewish people for the next 400 years, some great kings, some moments of real Jewish greatness. King Hezekiah, Yoshia, there were some great kings, but there were also some great villains. Now, this in Judea, in the southern kingdoms, it did follow a hereditary line. So they were always, son, father, son, or maybe a brother here and there, but there was a hereditary line. Some of them were good, some of them were bad. It was a mixed bag. During this whole period is when you also have, aside from the kings and the leaders, you had prophets. You had spiritual people whose job and mission it was to try to encourage the leaders to get back on the good path, on the straight and narrow, and to really motivate the nation, the people, to really, practice their Judaism and to be more inspired. So you probably have heard many of these great men, great leaders, people like Eliyahu, his student Elisha, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, the prophets that make up the Treyasar. These were the great men of, trying to motivate people. What happened to the northern kingdom? About 100 years before the destruction of the temple, 150 years before the destruction of the first temple, what happened was there was a king, there was a nation of Assyria, Ashur, and there was a king named Sancherib. And Sancherib waged war against the northern kingdom. And what happened? He won and drove out the northern kingdom and destroyed the northern kingdom. What happened to those 10 tribes? Where'd they go? Well, Sancherib drove them out physically from their land. And where did they all go? So you may have heard myths. Where are the 10? You ever heard the 10 lost tribes? What we're talking about, the 10 lost tribes, is what happened to the northern kingdom. We know what happened to the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom kept on going. Sancherib would eventually try attacking the southern kingdom during the times of Hezekiah, King Chizkiyahu. A miracle happened, and basically his army was obliterated overnight, and the southern kingdom kept on going. As an aside, some of the people in the northern kingdom did trickle down in the northern kingdom. Some of the individuals did trickle down to the south. As a matter of fact, the Talmud says we have a tradition that none of the 10 tribes will be permanently destroyed. There's always someone from one of the 12 tribes, but the bulk of the 10 tribes in the north were gone. Individuals did trickle down to the south. What happened to the northern kingdom? So what happened to these 10 lost tribes? It's one of these things everyone wants to know. Where did the 10 lost tribes go? What happened to them? So there are many theories. Many different people think many different things. As a matter of fact, there's one of the great heroes of Jewish history. You may have heard of a fellow named Menashe ben Israel. Menashe ben Israel is a significant person in Jewish history. Fast forward to the year 1600. He was the one who petitioned in the 1600s. He petitioned. Jews had been expelled from Great Britain in the 1200s. Menashe ben Israel was the one who petitioned, I think it was Cromwell, to let the Jews back in. He was successful. He wrote a book. He had a theory. That's what he's known to Jewish history for, and that is he was a tremendous person. He also had a whole book written why he thinks that the Native Americans, the Indians, the Native Americans were part of the 10 lost tribes. And many Jews throughout the ages have written books and theories that the 10 lost tribes are on the other side of a river, on the other side of a mountain, and one day we're just going to cross that valley and we're going to see this huge encampment of 10 tribes of Jews who are, eating their, bagels and lox and matzo ball soup and doing all these Jewish practices, and we've never seen them for the last 3,000 years. And of course, that's not what happened. That's a myth. It's a legend. What happened to the 10 lost tribes? I'll tell you what happened. And this is one of the most important lessons we will learn in Jewish history, because this is a lesson that turns into a pattern with near mathematical precision. With virtual mathematical precision is what happens time and time again throughout Jewish history. The following it's an equation. When Jews are then, because they were exiled out of their land, so they are now living amongst non-Jewish people. When Jews are living amongst non-Jews, and you have the following two ingredients: they are not particularly connected to the Torah. They are not studying the Torah and observing the Torah. Number one. And then number two, they are given the opportunity to assimilate. You know what will happen? They will. And that will be the end of the Jewish people. You know what happened to the 10 tribes? They were driven out of the land of Israel. They were probably brought to points north, like places like Turkey, probably, somewhere to the north, east, and west. And many of them were slaves, but eventually, after 1, 2, 3 generations, we know one thing about the northern kingdom. These were not observant Jews. These were not Jews who were connected to the Torah. So guess what happened? They got driven out. Within a few generations, that was it. They were gone, and they ceased to exist. That would be a pattern, and is a pattern in Jewish history. We see it right now in the United States of America. It's happening today. It happened in Spain. It happened. You just go through so many epochs and stories and periods of Jewish history. Of course, that pattern continued. The Jewish people in the southern kingdom, so they would stay for another 100 and something years until ultimately they were eventually exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonian Empire. They would attack the Jewish people. They would destroy the temple, and the Jews would basically be exiled into Babylon, to Babylonia, points east. That would mark the end of the first Beis Hamikdash, First Temple era. There were Jews some Jews remained in Israel, in Jerusalem, after the destruction of the First Temple for a few more years, until, of course, they had a Jewish governor over Judea, even post the destruction. His name was Gedaliah ben Achikam. Of course, he was then assassinated by a Jew, and that really ended the period of Jewish life in Jerusalem and Judea for the next 70 years. Where did all the Jews go? Most of the Jews were exiled to Babylonia. Where's Babylonia? It's primarily Iraq, but a little bit of Iran, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Fertile, that area, Mesopotamia. So mainly to the east, north, and east, places that not particularly hospitable to Jews nowadays, but you had Jews settled in those lands and would stay settled in those lands and still live in those lands ad hayom hazeh. There's still about 10, 20,000 Jews in Iran. Those are the same Jews that have been there since this time in Jewish history. It's basically they've been living there unbroken. And there were huge Jewish populations till the late 80s, to 1986, 87, when the Persian Jew, the 80% Persian Jewry left, 90%. But that was the same community from the Churban Bayis Rishon, from the destruction of the First Temple era. Of course, the Jews, they live in Babylon, in Babylonia. The Babylonian kingdom was and this is, it's well documented, even in many archaeological sources and many historical sources. The Babylonian kingdom was basically ruled over all of mankind, essentially. Where humanity was known to exist, the developed world, it was a huge kingdom. They would then be taken over by the Persian Empire. Who were they? We don't know but exactly who they were, but there were some Persian tribes. The Babylonian kingdom would be taken over by the Persians, and then they ended up ruling over that same huge empire. Of course, it was during this period. What happened was the Jews that were living in Babylonia and Persia in this area, again, there was the first years after their exile was traumatic. But what did they do? They moved on with life, and you bought houses, and you started watching football, and you start doing all those American things, and you become a Persian. Whatever. I mean, they were still Jewish, had a strong Jewish identity. They were still observing the Torah, but to some degree, they became comfortable in Persian life. And then, of course, what happens? The king has an assistant who's a jerk and an anti-Semite, and anti-Semitism rises. His name is Haman, and you have the Purim story. And there's a lesson there too, is that throughout the Jewish experience of living in exile, we grow comfortable. We find, we buy houses, you become acculturated, and anti-Semitism doesn't go away. And oh boy, have we learned that lesson in the last 12 months, right? We think that America's land free, home of the brave. Not going to happen here. And of course, some people have been saying, don't get too comfortable. Please God, without getting too far afield, I do think the United States is a different country than many other countries, but this is a pattern. This is not a new thing where we think, no, but it's going to be different, and good. And it's not, and they don't like us, and many want us dead, and you are on the defensive, and all of that. They would stay in Persia. The Persian exile would last 70 years. In slow waves, some of the leaders and some of the Jews that were living in Babylonia, Persia, it's the same thing, made their way back to Judea. There was one leader, his name was Zerubbabel, a fellow named Zerubbabel. Where do you say his name? He gets a shout out in the Ma'os Tzor, Zerubbabel, but you remember Kate's Bavel, Zerubbabel, the Kate Shivim Noshati, if you remember, in Ma'os Tzor, the song we sing after lighting the menorah, we have a shout out to Zerubbabel. He was a leader of the Jewish people, but he was a small leader of the Jewish people. Him and a small band of Jews actually they were authorized to go back to Jerusalem, and they didn't rebuild Jerusalem. They didn't rebuild the temple, but they were able to start Jewish life with a trickle. Some of the avodah, some of the sacrifices were able to be rebuilt despite not having the Beis Hamikdash. It was actually, if I recall correctly, he actually precedes the Purim story. Purim story happens, and it's after the Purim story. It's unclear historically who's who. There's the leaders of the Persian Empire. There's Daryavesh, there's Koresh, and we don't know who's who. This is actually where historically even the historical record, it's not clear who's who. But someone gave the Jewish people permission to go back to the land of Israel and to start rebuilding, life back in Judea. And we're taught that there was the leader of the Jewish people at the time was a fellow named Ezra HaSofer, Ezra. And Ezra was given permission, you can go back to Israel and rebuild. And you know what Ezra does? He stays put. He doesn't go. Do you know why? This is such an important lesson. Because his Rebbe, his rabbi, Baruch ben Neriah, the rabbi who he was learning Torah from, was living in Bavel and was, I guess, unable to travel. He was probably an elderly man, my guess is. And Ezra felt that it was the more appropriate than rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash, than rebuilding the temple and restoring life in Jerusalem. It's more important to be able to study Torah under my Rebbe, under my rabbi. And meaning he understood that this was the will of God, that it's better for me to stay put for a little bit longer, to learn a little bit more Torah. Now think about it. Had Ezra gone to Israel and started rebuilding the temple, he would have been learning plenty of Torah. He would have been good, right? In Babylonia, he was just learning a little bit better. Why? Because his Rebbe was there. What does that mean? His rabbi, his Masorah, his chain of tradition, something which is so sacred and important. Talk about studying Torah and studying under, a scholar and someone, I've had rebbeim, rabbis in my life who, you can't do it you can't study Torah. You can't be Jewish on an island. You need to have a sacred Masorah. Masorah means a chain, a tradition. And Ezra understood it's more important for me to stay put here for a few more years to learn a little bit more Torah in an appropriate environment. And indeed, the Talmud says, you see from here that Talmud Torah, studying Torah is more important than rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash. So remarkable, remarkable lesson. Eventually, Baruch ben Neriah, I guess he dies, and Ezra does go to the land of Israel. He rebuilds the temple. And it's interesting when the temple's rebuilt and everyone celebrates. Everyone's rejoicing. It's a moment to celebrate, of course. The elders, what do? They weep, they mourn. Why? Because they remember what the first temple looked like. And yes, the second temple was amazing, but in the shadow of the first, we're going to cry. That same idea, Hiskatnu Hadoros, the generations get weaker, and they had the yardstick to be able to measure and say, this is amazing, but look what we once had. It pales in comparison. Despite the fact that the Beis HaMikdash was rebuilt, many people did not, actually, my understanding is the majority of Jews stayed put in Persia and Babylonia, and would stay like that throughout the period of the Second Temple era. This begins now the Second Temple era. Many, I think even most Jews still stayed in Babylonia and are held to fault for that. And it's an amazing thing. Ezra, he actually punishes the Leviim, many of the tribe of Levi. They are apparently singled out for being one of the groups that really were hesitant to go back. And he singles them out for not, their love of the land of Israel. And it's amazing. The Talmud tells us, Asara Yuchsin Ola mi Bavel, Ola mi Ezra mi Bavel, that there were that Ezra he goes up from Bavel, from Babylonia to the land of Israel, and things are a mess. Jews are intermarried. Jews are assimilated. He reinaugurates the position of Kohen Gadol, the high priest. We're taught who is the high priest. Beginning of the Second Temple era, his name was Yehoshua, Joshua, not the same Joshua we talked about earlier, just has the same name. Of course, Joshua is not married. He's intermarried. He's assimilated. The Kohen Gadol, the high priest. Nehemiah, who would be the next leader of the Jewish people after Ezra, was a fellow Nehemiah. He rebuilds the walls around Jerusalem. And now Jerusalem is a little bit more inhabited. Now, just as an aside, if you go to Jerusalem today, the old city of Jerusalem. You ever go to the old city, right? Been to Jerusalem, old city, and you see the old walls? Those are not the old walls of Jerusalem. Those are new. Those are not the old walls of it. I remember when I learned that when I was like 20 years old, I was like, what? Those are actually very new. Those are built by Suleiman the Magnificent in the 1600s. The old city of Jerusalem is not those. The old city of Jerusalem is not what you think it is. So those, you can still see there are plates in archaeological digs. There are places where you can see some of the walls that were built by Nehemiah. You can actually see some of the walls that we think were built by Solomon during the First Temple era. It was just a remarkable thing. Eventually, fine. So Nehemiah and Jewish life continues in Jerusalem. Now, in the Second Temple era, Israel is not as inhabited from coast to coast as it was in the First Temple era. So we think of Israel today and we think of the whole thing. And it was basically in 2 or 3 regions. You had Judea right around Jerusalem and the Judean hills, still where the southern kingdom kind of was. Up north in the Galilee was a Jewish region, places like Sipori, which is now a beautiful archaeological dig, kind of near the Golan, a little bit south of the Golan, in what's called the Galil, and along the coast. But the rest of Israel was still inhabited by a lot of places. It was during this time where you have what was called the Anshe Knesset Hagadola. The Anshe Knesset Hagadola, the men of the Great Assembly. What was the Anshe Knesset Hagadola? The Anshe Knesset Hagadola were a group of 120 figures, 120 great leaders of the Jewish people. It wasn't like one academy that met at one point. It seems that there was overlap, but the Talmud identifies there were 120 people, including some of the great prophets like Mordechai from the Purim story, including some of the great leaders of the Jewish people and others who weren't prophets. And they really affixed a lot of what we take as things that we identify as being part of Jewish life. They were the ones who instituted a lot of the rabbinic elements of Judaism, which we are so used to. Davening, the structure of prayer, a lot of the laws of Shabbos, a lot of what we see as of normative Jewish life was established by the people called, by this group, this council called the Anshe Knesset HaGadol, the men of the Great Assembly. And that represented an epoch and a watershed in Jewish history. Go today to Israel. What's the legislative body called? The Knesset. How many Chavrei Knesset are there? How many people serve in the Knesset? 120. Where did they get that number from? The Anshe Knesset HaGadol. I could tell you, with all due respect to my friends in the Chavrei Knesset, none of them are as good as, quite as pious and great as the men of the Anshe Knesset HaGadol, but that's where the idea came from. They formalized prayer. They enacted many rabbinic enactments. Even the Ksav Ashuri, which is the font on a Torah scroll. Apparently, the exact typographic font was, they were the ones who established it, and we understood what it was. And the hour is late, so maybe we'll end here, and we'll pick it up next time a little bit. We'll have to cover the end of the Second Temple era and then move on to the period of the Mishnah and the Talmud. But it's going to dovetail beautifully with the story of the Anshe Knesset HaGadol. Because next week, when we meet Wednesday at 7 o'clock, we're really going to talk about what was the Mishnah, what was the Talmud, and a lot of the Mishnah and the Talmud really relies heavily on the enactments, the gezeras, the takanas, the decrees, the prohibitions, a lot of the rabbinic life which we have from the Anshe Knesset HaGadola. So please God, next week, we'll cover that in more detail. We didn't get fully through the Second Temple era, but we got to the start of the Second Temple era. So please God, next week, we'll pick it up mid-Second Temple era. And if anyone has any questions, now's a perfect time.